Hi, I'm Doug Olenek, online editor with SC Media, and I'm here at RSA 2018 with Chris Seng, VP of Research with CA Veracode. How are you today, Chris?
I'm doing great.
Great, thanks for being here. I'm going to talk a little bit about open source software today. I'm curious if we could start off with you just giving us some of your general thoughts on open source and the security issues surrounding that.
Yeah, open source is kind of an overlooked area from a security standpoint, but it's really important because that's the way that we build software. If you think about building a new product today, you're not writing everything from scratch if you're a developer. You're borrowing components that do common functions that you don't need to re-implement. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. And so when we assemble that software from all these open source and commercial libraries, we get the functionality, but we also get the security risks inherent in those. So if there are vulnerabilities in a particular library that I'm using, then my product also now has those vulnerabilities. So the security issue there is you have to be aware of the vulnerabilities that you are inheriting into your own software and keeping track of new vulnerabilities as they're discovered in those libraries over time. And if you're not paying attention to that and patching and kind of staying up to date, then your software is essentially getting more and more exposed over time.
Now, is there a way for a company to vet that open source software before they put it into service?
Yeah, there is. I mean, there are numerous public sources of information that track vulnerabilities in products. One of them, the most well-known, is the National Vulnerability Database. And essentially, anytime there's a public release of a vulnerability, it becomes known and the company goes out and patches it, that goes into their database. So you can look up by product, by library, by version number, and get a listing of all of the known vulnerabilities, the criticality, exactly how they're exploited, sometimes proof of concept exploits. And so all that information is available. What a lot of companies are not doing is they're not keeping track of that bill of materials for their own software. So in order to look up things in the database, you need to know what you're using and which versions. And oftentimes that just gets overlooked.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's also a lot going on the DevOps side of things right now. Could you talk a little bit about how DevOps teams are having to change how they function in order to get along better in this current state of cybersecurity that we're in?
Yeah, DevOps is an interesting trend. The past few years it's really got a lot of pickup, and the idea is kind of shared responsibility. Developers don't just throw things over the wall to ops anymore. Ops doesn't, understands kind of the reasons for building the functionality, and there's a lot more shared responsibility. And with that, we're seeing a push for security to become part of that responsibility as well. The problem is that the traditional way we've done security is not necessarily to be quite as fast as they require it to be. Mm-hmm. DevOps lets you innovate faster, it lets you release more often, there's a lot more reliance on automation. And so from a security perspective, we have to think in that mindset. We have to figure out how can we automate as much as possible into the development workflow so that we're not creating manual steps, so that we're not holding them up. Security cannot be delaying innovation in any way, and that's something that's really becoming more and more prominent, more obvious as DevOps picks up.
Is there ever any pushback from folks who are developing software when you go in and say, sorry, but there's a huge flaw here that you guys have to fix?
And sometimes at the beginning there's a little bit of an educational process where they need to see the exploit work. You need to kind of show them what happens, but then there's also oftentimes a light bulb moment where you're like, oh, I never really understood how somebody could exploit this weakness in my code. And once they see it, they kind of understand it, and then the next time you may not have to demonstrate it, they'll kind of trust you. But a lot of this does come back to education. A lot of developers are now being relied on to have some security accountability in the stuff that they build, but they're not being trained to do that. They're not being given the proper information. And so there's right now a disconnect in that we need to really get after.
Are you seeing security professionals being brought into DevOps teams to instill that level of training? Or?
Well, we're seeing a number of different approaches there. Usually security teams aren't big enough to inject themselves into every team. Because if you think about it, an application security or product security team is way smaller than the number of developers. And what we have been doing a lot of is trying to build security experts within the teams. So you find developers that want to learn about security. It looks good on their resume, they learn something new, it's curiosity, it's just an area they can explore. And so we teach them enough about what they need to know to help their team look for those types of issues and know when to escalate to a security team. But that way we can kind of scale the security aspect of the work and also kind of give people new skills at the same time.
Great. Well, Chris, thank you very much for sharing some of your time at this very busy show. And again, I'm Doug Olenek, online editor with SC Media here at RSA 2018.